A blessed day to all who are watching, and I hope the Lord will accompany you in your study of His words. The topic I'm going to share with you is very important because it is often discussed, especially in the world of social media. In this discussion, we will scholarly discuss the difference between idols and images. And it is important to reveal the truth that what many say that images are idols or that all images are idols is not true. Let us remember that not all those who use the Bible understand what they are saying. Many resort to prop texting but out of context. The sad thing is what they do is not exegesis but eisegesis. In this forum, our friends, biblical scholars, will help us prove that not all images are idols. To join us during the forum are the following well-known Protestant biblical scholars: Dr. Craig Blumberg, Dr. Craig Kinner, and Dr. David De Silva. These scholars can read and understand biblical languages. Thus, they have the requisite skills and knowledge to perform exegesis properly. This is what we can read on page 349 of a scholarly book, Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. Therefore, reliable biblical interpretation requires careful evaluation of the grammatical nuances of the original language texts of the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament and Greek New Testament. Ideally, every interpreter should know these biblical languages. Even the best translations do not and probably should not bring them out. Where good modern translations do express clearly some grammatical nuances, they involve a greater or lesser degree of interpretation, for scholars do not always agree on the significance of certain grammatical constructions in a given passage. Knowing the biblical languages equips the interpreter to weigh the evidence to identify the grammatical explanation that fits the text best. People who do not know Hebrew or Greek must remember that they work at a disadvantage. So, let us listen to our biblical scholars short discussions and analysis regarding images and idols. Hopefully, through this forum, we will be enlightened.
What is the difference between an image and an idol? An image is a visual representation of a person or object. It can be a photograph, painting, sculpture, statue. The Ten Commandments tell us not to make images of God. God is invisible. Human beings were created in God's image, but sin has marred them. Jesus came as God's perfect, sinless image. Most Protestants, Orthodox, and Catholics throughout church history have determined it is acceptable to create images of Jesus. An idol is anything a person worships in place of the one true living God over all the universe. An idol can be another human being who is treated like a god, or something like money, sex, or power. An idol does not have to have an image, though it can, whereas most images are not idols.
We know that not all images are idols because we ourselves are made in the image of God, and we are not idols unless somebody worships us, in which case we should tell them to stop. But in terms of other kinds of images, when you're reading a book, the letters on the page are images. The words that we read symbolize something. They symbolize words, and words in turn symbolize ideas. So the idea of using something to symbolize something else or draw our attention to something else isn't wrong in itself. In fact, some languages, including many very ancient languages, actually were pictograph alphabets. That is, instead of doing it letter by letter, sound by sound, they were based on images, based on pictures. So the question is, what are the pictures leading us to do? If the pictures invite us to worship God, if the pictures invite us to appreciate God's creation, if the pictures tell a story that may be edifying, those can all be good things. Obviously, if you're watching, say, a Christian movie or something like that about Jesus, that's a great thing. If, however, they lead us to worship something other than God, then it's a bad thing.
Hello, my name is David De Silva, and I'm here to speak with you about the question of when does an image become an idol? The first of the 10 Commandments, as the Roman Catholic Church enumerates them, prohibits the worship of any god besides the God of Israel and prohibits the fashioning of any sculpted image to be used as an object of worship. We read in Exodus 20, verse 2 and following, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. The version of this commandment in Deuteronomy 5, verses 6 to 10 is almost identical. Protestants and Jews break this commandment into two, combining the two prohibitions of coveting into a single commandment to arrive still at a total of 10. This might give greater weight to Protestants and Jews to the idea of not making a graven image. But however the commandments are enumerated, it seems quite clear that the goal of this commandment is to ensure that the people of Israel do not worship in the manner of the nations around them or the nations they are about to displace as they take possession of the land of Canaan. This would apply both to the worship of other gods besides their own deliverer and the orchestration of worship around any physical representation of animal or person, which was the hallmark of worship in every nation besides Israel. Jews wrestled for centuries concerning how to keep this commandment faithfully. Indeed, for the most part, this commandment accounts for the fact that there is almost no depiction of birds, animals, or human beings in art in the land of Israel through the 3rd century AD. Even Herod the Great did not decorate his palaces within the territory of Judea with anything but geometric and floral designs. By the 5th century AD, however, we find Jews incorporating depictions of animals, human beings, and even mythological beings like the figures of the zodiac into their art, even the art in their synagogues. Many Jewish teachers found value in creating what they would call a fence around the commandments, observing prohibitions that kept people a full step away from being in danger of violating the commandment itself. It appears that they treated the prohibition of sculpture and artistic representations as a whole as such a fence. We will be in less danger of worshiping a sculpted image of a person or animal, they had reasoned, if we refrain from making such images in the first place. Nevertheless, the commandment itself here seems to be focused on the prohibition of idolatrous worship, not artistic expression. One pointer in this direction is the usage of the Hebrew word pesel, translated idol, here in the first commandment. Every time this word occurs in the Hebrew Bible, it is quite clear from the context that idolatrous worship, and not merely sculpted representation, is the issue. This does not mean that Christians, who, as St. Paul said, are not under law but under grace, can afford to be careless in their fashioning and their use of images. We must carefully distinguish in our own hearts between the veneration we give to the one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the acts of respect shown, for example, to the sculpted figures or other representations of the saints in our churches, persons who have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb just as we have been. But it does mean that Christians do not need to fear sculpted representations as evils in themselves, and are free even to use them as aids to devotion. But we must never place any figure before God himself, and never slip into any action or attitude before a sculpted image that might be considered worship. For then we have indeed crossed the line between art and idolatry.
If we study carefully the works of many non-Catholic biblical scholars, we will find out that they confirm in their books that not all images are idols. First, on page 107 of the book written by Protestant biblical scholar Dr. Norman Geisler, titled The Big Book of Bible Difficulties, he clearly stated, further, not all images are idols. Second, on page 417 of the book written by Protestant biblical scholar Dr. Bruce Waltke, titled An Old Testament Theology, he said, biblical writers made no mention of prescription against forms and images. Third, on page 116 of the book written by Protestant biblical scholar Dr. Gleason Archer, titled New International Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, he explained, there is idolatry if people create images to worship them. And fourth, on page 511 of the book written by Protestant biblical scholar Dr. Speros Sudjatis, titled The Complete Word Study Dictionary, New Testament, he said, idolon, in the New Testament, it stands for an idol or image set up to be worshipped as a god. Proof texting is basically taking an isolated verse out of all context. Remember, Scripture can be easily misrepresented by representing it within one's own theological and life context without attention to its own context. Before we start analyzing this, let us first read the Hebrew text of Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 to 5. Lo yehye lecha Elohim acharim alpanay. Lo taase lecha pisel viholti mo na asher basamayim mimaal ba asher baaretz mitahat ba asher bamayim mitahat laaretz. Lut istahavi lahim vilu taabdem kay anoche Adonai Elohecha Elkana. Poked abot avon albanim al-shilishim vi al-ribiim lisunay. The Jews had no monotheism until the Babylonians drove them out of their country in 587 BC and deported thousands of them to Babylon. The prohibition described the relation of Adonai to Israel by categorically eliminating other gods, or Elohim Achirim in Hebrew, as far as Israel is concerned. Verse 4 tells us what the them, or the him in Hebrew, describes, namely, idol or pisel in any of several forms. The pronoun in lahim in verse 5 no doubt has as its antecedent Elohim Achrim, or other gods, in verse 3. The command in verse 5 not to bow down or worship them, Lotistah Lahim in Hebrew, requires a grammatical referent that tells the reader to what the dem or lahim in Hebrew refers. Pisel literally means idol. We can also read the Hebrew word pisel in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 18 to 19, and Isaiah chapter 44, verse 9. Another popular verse is Psalms chapter 115, verse 4. Let us read the Hebrew text of this verse. At sabihim kisef visahab maase yedi Adam. At sab is just another synonym for idols used often. The psalm clearly involved in anti-idolatry criticism. Note verse 8 and its reference in trusting idols. Then the psalm goes on to urge in trusting the God of Israel. The psalmist criticizes those who treat images as divine. Now, let us remember the habit of interpreting and preaching without context is a careless habit. If we go back to Exodus chapter 20, verse 4, which fundamentalists love to use, if we look at this in the Septuagint text of Exodus chapter 20, verse 4, we can read the Greek words, hopoieses si auto idolon, and that is the equivalent of the Hebrew words, dotaase lecha pisel. Idolon is an image for worship. If we wanted to express a total prohibition of any image, it could be hopoieses si auto pasan ekona. Brothers and sisters, I hope you have learned a lot from this discussion. I suggest that you replay this video to clearly understand our discussion. Thank you for watching. Merry Christmas, everyone.